All right, so I have this question here from Abubakar, and Abubakar is saying, my greatest problem as a graphic designer is indecisiveness and time management. I usually get stuck on what font to use, what colors to use in a design. Sometimes I may envision a certain typeface or color for certain designs. On applying them, I discover that they do not match the idea I'm trying to bring to life. This ends up consuming much more time than necessary for the work. Did you come across this problem in your early days as a designer, and how did you overcome it? Or what advice will you give to someone going through this? Now, this is a very good question Abubakar is asking, and he's talking about a certain frustration he feels with his design process. Number one, he kind of feels like sometimes he envisions something in his head, but when he's working on it doesn't look the way he thought it would look in his head, and that might affect choice of color, choice of font, and then this ends up taking so much time than he initially allocated to doing this design work. Now, what I really want to say here is creativity is one of the most underestimated things in the world. Creativity. One of the most underestimated things in the world is creativity. We as designers even underestimate what it takes to be creative. And this underestimation we have about creativity is based on certain misconception we have about the creative process. I think the first misconception is that the creative process is easy. We feel the creative process is easy. We feel it's a straight line from here to there, straight. We don't understand that the creative process is a winding road. It is not easy, it is not direct. It is not from here to there. It is from here to there, to there, to there, and you now arrive at somewhere you never even thought you were going to arrive at in the first place. The creative process is not a straight road, it's a very windy road, and sometimes a very rough road. So, one misconception we have is that creativity is easy, it comes easily. The second misconception we have is that creativity is fast, and it's very linked to the first misconception that creativity is easy. Because we feel it's easy, we feel it can be done in the blink of an eye. So we feel the creativity doesn't take time. It shouldn't take time. But it does. Creativity does take time. And a lot of times, the longest route to arriving at a creative end is always the invisible route. And what I mean by the invisible route is the thinking, is your thought. It is thinking about that thing that you are creating. Sometimes the doing of a thing might take a very little time, but the thinking about it, the stewing about it in your mind takes a long time. And that's why when I used to design logos, a lot of people used to ask me, why are you taking 14 working days to do a logo? You can do this thing in 1 hour. You can do it in 1 day. But then they didn't understand. It still came down to this misconception that creativity is easy, that creativity is based on talent. But it isn't. Art might be a talent, but creativity is not a talent. Creativity is not a talent. Creativity is a process. Is a process. Art is a tangible thing. Creativity largely is not tangible. It's a process. It's a process that requires freedom. The greatest asset that a creative person can have is freedom. If creativity is going to express itself at its best, it's freedom. And that's why it's hard to be creative when you are working on a commission job. That is a job for which you have a client. These two things that Abubakar is experiencing, this thing of What I had in my head is not what I'm having in reality. The frustration of that always happens when you're working with a client, or most times happen when you're working with a client. Because one thing that happens when you're working with a client is that you begin to second guess yourself. You begin to second guess yourself. So what happens is when you're doing a client job, the first thing is there's a nervousness that kicks in. The nervousness that you're being paid for this job. So you begin to think, I hope the client would like this. This red that I'm using, I hope they would like it. Or would they prefer yellow? Or will blue work better? The way I am seeing this thing, I'm not sure whether the client would like it. Would they think I've done enough work? Would they think that this thing is commensurate to the amount they are paying me? Am I charging too little for the work I'm putting in? You see, these questions are the questions that delay creativity. They stunt and they hamper our creativity. So this mental self-doubt that we have based on a commission job is what makes it frustrating to think of yellow, and when you're working, yellow is not working. Then what you begin to think is that you're stuck. So immediately you start using a color that doesn't work with what matches in your head, you already begin to think you are stuck. Because when we work with clients, the first thing we want is progress. We want to be moving towards the finish line as smoothly as possible. And as I said, creativity is a rough, windy road. So the pressure that comes with this client is expecting this job. I do not have time to be experimenting with two colors. In the long run, frustrates the creative process. So you think you are stuck. But the fact is that you are not stuck. When you are working on something that seems to be a creative project, you must see it as an adventure. So when you have an obstacle, what you think is, how do I get across this obstacle? How do I get around this obstacle? And then you study the obstacle and say, this is interesting. Why is this thing blocking my way? Should I create a way around it or a way through it? Or does it become in itself a part of the journey? Do I divert away from this obstacle entirely, where the obstacle becomes a guide to where next I should be going? So the obstacle is telling me, don't go this way. That's the sense of adventure. But when you have an end in mind, an obstacle becomes a frustration, because all you see is where you want to go rigidly, and then you are hampering creativity. That's one of the frustrations I had with working as a graphic designer for commission. Because graphic design is such a commercial art, it can get a little too subjective. And that for me, that's my biggest frustration with graphic design as a profession. It is very subjective as compared to art, visual art. It's very expressive. The graphic designer doesn't have as much freedom as the visual artist. The visual artist can go to his canvas and just splash paint depending on how he feels. He expresses the way he feels. If he wakes up feeling angry a particular morning, he takes red paint and he splashes it. And he goes to bed. The next day, he wakes up feeling joyful. He takes yellow paint and he splashes it. The next day, he wakes up feeling sad. He takes blue paint and he splashes it. And he does this every single day of the week. And at the end of the week, he looks at all he has splashed on that canvas and he calls it my week on canvas. You see, he doesn't know what the final product of that thing is going to look like. But then he has the freedom to express, and then he takes his expression out and he puts it out there as his truth. It is his truth. And then people come around and they look at it and because he's not being commissioned to do it, there's no expected end. He doesn't have judges. What he has are observers that come and look at this. Oh, this is quite interesting. I wonder what was going through this man's mind. And then he can come and explain that and say, this is my week. And then someone aligns with it and say, I understand this story. It makes sense to me. And they pay for it. You see, They align with it not because he was trying to make them align with it. They align with his work because it was his truth. This truth is what most people as graphic designers cannot do. The complexity of graphic design is that you're not working entirely with your truth. You are trying to find out the client's truth. So the client comes with a puzzle and they want you to form it into a picture that they desire. And that's why it's hard to be creative as a graphic designer. That's why you feel frustration when what you have in your head is not materializing in what you are doing. The first thing is that you begin to say is, am I beginning to get it wrong? And that begins to make you fear that you are veering off the path that the client wants you to be on. So as a graphic designer, if a client comes with a project, let's say a logo project, and you discuss with the client, and client say, I like red. Red seems to be a great color, that kind of thing. And you take that information as a graphic designer and start working with red, and red doesn't work. You can see it visually, it's not working. It becomes a frustration. Because now you kind of think to yourself, do I have the freedom to use yellow that works better? And if I use yellow that works better, will the client want to pay me, or would they want their money back? Would I lose money? And that's the problem with graphic design. It is highly commercial and subject to the opinion of the client. What happens with graphic design is because you're working with a client that needs a project that is time-based. Every time you get stuck in quotes, you begin to panic that I have 2 more days, I have 3 more days, I have 1 more day to articulate this thing that the client wants me to do. And so time becomes the enemy, not the ally. Unlike with the artist, who works with time. He splashes today, he goes to bed, wakes up tomorrow, splashes. He can choose to paint his week or his year, depending on him. So that painting on the canvas can be a combination of paint over 7 days, or he can make it a combination of paint over 365 days. He has the freedom where time and expected end doesn't constrain him. So how does a graphic designer maneuver this? The truth of the matter is, with graphic design, I think one thing we need to learn to do when you are working with a client is try to make it like you're doing a self-project. And don't define expected ends. When you're working with a client from the very onset, don't restrict yourself to an expected end. And don't allow a client to restrict your vision to an expected end. So a client telling you, I want this thing to be red. Our colors are red. Our colors are blue and yellow. So we need to use this. Our font is this font. So we need to use this. I think one thing you can do, especially if you are working with a client that is working on a new project, it's very, very hard to do this with someone that is an established client. So if you are working with Coca-Cola, they are telling you their colors are red, then there's nothing you can do. This is a company that is over 100 years old. That's why when people wish to work with established companies, they do not understand that when you're working with established companies, creativity becomes a huge mountain. People don't understand the joy of working with a small client that is nothing, that is working with a clean slate, nothing to build on. You are the one that is carving the blocks. There is so much joy in working with those kind of clients. I'll tell you, there are 2 jobs that are the most joy for a graphic designer to do: personal work and working with a small client. Working with a highly established client can be a nightmare. Ask anyone that has worked with a highly established client. Nightmare. The only thing that looks good is how much you are being paid. But the back and forth is crazy. In fact, I know so many people that work with established clients that begin to question whether they should be doing graphic design. And a lot of them have dropped out from this career of graphic design or design altogether because of nasty experiences they've had working with established clients. Take joy in personal projects. Take joy in working with the small guy that is still willing to listen to you. So where I was going with this is when you're working with a client, especially a young, new person that is just starting out, don't have established, rigid ends. Oh, at the end of this process, we should have a green website, a red website, a yellow website. No, 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 no. You are beginning to kill creativity. You are killing creativity. So one thing you must be able to tell your clients is that, you know what, let's take this road. In the end, what we want to arrive at is an emotion, not a color, not a font, not a style, but an emotion. So at the end of the day, the emotion we want is to convey a feeling of joy, of happiness, of adventure, of prestige, of authority. So when you start going on that road, if where you end up is red feeling or a red sense of ambition, that's good. If what you end up with is a blue sense of ambition, that's good. You understand? At the end, you do not know what you will end up with in terms of a physical product. So you must leave it open-ended so that you don't get frustrated when you have roadblocks with artifacts like color and font and images. You must let those things, hold on to those things loosely. Hold on to, especially even when you're working on your own personal projects. Don't have rigid ends in mind. They only make the journey more frustrating. More frustrating. As it comes to time, one thing I tell people is that you must try to buy as much time as possible. Never underestimate this entity called creativity. This is hugely underestimated. Even if you feel in your mind that it's going to take you 1 day to do the project, ask for 1 week. Ask for 1 month if you can. It's better to have too much time than too little time, because creativity sometimes takes time. Creativity takes time. So this thing that Abubakar has said, that sometimes the project seems like it's taking more time than it should, you don't determine how much time the project takes. You must understand that creativity is not the passenger, it's the driver. We are the passenger. It takes us on an adventure and it decides how long it will take for us to get there. So have enough respect to overestimate how much time than to underestimate how much time it will take. Buy as much time. Buy as much time as possible. Buy a ridiculous amount of time. Too many graphic designers don't have enough time. It's not that they're not creative, but they don't respect the spirit of creativity enough. They think they are the master, not understanding that they are the passenger. Buy enough time, as much time as possible. This is another thing that is very hard to do when you're working with established clients. Very hard to buy time. Very hard. You can be very rigid with time. But when you're working on your personal project, you have the luxury of time. When you're working with a small client, they are willing to give you more time than an establishment is willing to give you. But the lack of time is a huge stumbling block when it comes to creativity. So my advice to you, Abubakar, is number one, what is happening to you is not unusual. That you think of something in your head, and when you are doing it in reality, it doesn't form that way. It's because creativity is not a one thought process. What you had in your head was your first thought. If everything were perfect, when you begin to walk, you begin to go through your second thought, your third thought, and all these your thoughts are being formed by hindrances that you have. And so things will definitely change. This was a problem I had working as a creative, not just in my elementary days, but then even when I was well established. until I learn to surrender. That the first idea I have is just the first idea. But then I have to submit to the spirit of creativity to take me to where it believes is best. So I must be able to surrender. And that's why going into a project, I hardly tell a client we are going to end up with this logo. What I tell them is we are going to end up with this emotion. This is the emotion we are going for, but how it's actually going to look, I don't know. It's just like childbirth. When a man and a woman get together, the woman gets pregnant, but that's as good as you can do. You cannot determine what the child will look like, what complexion, even what sex the child would be. You cannot. You have to trust the process. And at the end, at the delivery, you realize that you are as much an audience, even though you were there at the initiation of everything. At delivery, you are as much an audience. You are living in wonder and awe, just like every other person. What a beautiful baby. You don't know what the baby is going to look like. The same thing with design. You don't know how long the pregnancy will take. You can estimate. Sometimes the pregnancy, 7 months, the baby is out. Sometimes 6 months, the baby is out. Sometimes 9 months, sometimes 10 months, sometimes 12 months. But you need to be able to surrender. You don't know what day the baby is going to come out. That's exactly how creativity is. So you must learn to enjoy the process and respect the process.